Thank you. Thank you to Monsignor and to President Archer and the Academy for allowing me to speak here to all of you today. Today, I bring to you a perspective that is somewhat different from this perspective of all my colleagues, my brothers and sisters from around the world. Like many of you, I too preside over a bench that hears human trafficking cases, and like many of you, I also was a federal prosecutor in my past where I presided over numerous child prostitution cases. But although I have been sitting as a federal judge in Chicago for 10 years, my dedication to justice has drawn me far beyond the four corners of my courtroom. In addition to teaching human trafficking to law students in 3 different law schools, I am blessed to have partnered with many bar associations, academia, nonprofit organizations, and the state and federal judiciaries to create training programs for judges and task forces throughout the United States. These programs assist organizations across the U.S. in comprehending the victimization of this global human rights violation. I am also honored to have trained the judiciaries of numerous organizations, of numerous countries throughout the world, through the State Department, through the American Bar Association, through the International Bar Association, and through organizations like Lawyers Without Borders and Vital Voices. In all, I've traveled to 20 countries, and I have been there on anti-trafficking assignments. I've trained their judiciaries, over thousands of judges, and I've studied their laws and met with their police and law enforcement officers and NGOs. And this is always to better understand why does this human rights violation remain so pervasive, so insidious, and so hard to eradicate. And it is from this broader perspective that I bring to you a challenge, a call to immediate awareness of what I believe to be the most significant reason why human trafficking persists: public corruption. As you all know, in most illegal trafficking cases, the commodity that has illegal value is fungible, drugs or guns, for example. And once that product is consumed, the trafficker seeks for a new supply source. But unlike all of those other illegal activities that invade our rule of law on a global level, the crime brought here to us today takes a human being as its product, reuses that life repeatedly, abusing that life until that person loses all sense of value to himself and to his community. Recognizing this, we all have been gathered here today to be called as a unified voice to protect the dignity of human life. Life with purpose, life with aspiration, unstifled in its potential to grow. Like any illegal commodity on the market, when a human being is sold through channels, someone holding a position of public authority abuses the authority to allow that sale to occur. Whether that official agrees to profit himself through the acceptance of a bribe that facilitates the abuse, or even more broadly, whether the official abandons his duty to enforce the law to protect the public by turning a blind eye to a violation that inflicts injury upon a class of individuals that the official does not deem worthy of protection: the poor, the hungry, the homeless, the disabled, the uneducated. This is, my friends, the common thread that ties all of us together. It is what is perpetuating human trafficking: abuse of public authority and the abandonment of our public officials to do their duty. To explain this common link, let me share with you some scenarios from around the world from my teachings in Cyprus a couple years ago, and many of you are represented here who were in many of my programs. I interviewed some prostitutes who were sex trafficked in brothels. They described how every 2 weeks they were brought to a hospital to be tested for sexually transmitted diseases. Of course, these hospital visits were not to ensure the woman's health or safety. They were simply to make sure that the valuable commodity of a clean product, one without disease, could be sold on the market. And while they were brought in vans to the hospital, they were guarded by local police. We sat under a lemon tree in a beautiful day in Cyprus, and the women looked furtively around them, not for the traffickers, but for the police, because they said if the police saw them, they would return them as property to the traffickers. In Bangladesh in 2013, the world watched in horror as an entire building collapsed in the garment district, killing some 1,130 workers, a significant percentage of them children. Yet building codes and labor laws were sacrificed in order to sell clothes at rock-bottom prices to many markets in the Western Hemisphere. India's labor laws require building inspections and prohibit child labor. Yet the collapse of that one building in that district, just one building, killed over 1,000 individuals, primarily women and children, earning less than €38 per month. In Egypt, where I just returned, I spoke with judges who described female children being sold to wealthy foreigners as summer brides or vacation brides. Meanwhile, border inspectors permit the flow of exploited children to cross into wealthy neighboring countries with such regularity that many of these children are sold 2 or 3 times prior to their 16th birthday, all the while passing across borders where there are authorities inspecting documents. In Kenya, victims groups describe how local law enforcement are paid by the offenders not to file a police report, or simply to delay the case or delay the services to a victim. And as evidence is lost and court dates are missed and cases linger on overburdened dockets for years, the victims, many of whom come from hundreds of kilometers from the local court, surrender their hope for justice, and they simply give up. In Zambia, the copper mines thrive on child labor, even though laws prohibit it. But when money is available, law enforcement can be bought, and sometimes for as little as a day's wage or less. In Croatia, in Latvia, in Lithuania, women are lured for jobs through the internet, jobs that offer them salaries as household help, restaurant workers, or models, only to be coerced into the sex trade, while local law enforcement turn their backs on what they believe to be a woman's personal choice, as opposed to the breaking and denigration of her will. Even at home in Chicago, girls are sexually trafficked through small, opportunistic groups that glorify pimp culture. They are lured by gangs, are branded like animals with the pimp's name in order to claim his right to his property. And in spite of both state and local laws and federal laws in every state in the United States, local police often allow the hotels to act as brothels for the sex trade, instead focusing their priorities on what they believe to be more important crimes, and more important crimes that will be prosecuted by the local and federal authorities. At its most basic, public corruption comprises the taking of money for an official act, accepting a false identification document, allowing the passing of a border without a document, not performing one's official duty, not performing an inspection of a building or a school, or not arresting an individual. When viewed more broadly, however, it is also the refusal of our elected officials to prioritize the already existing laws to protect the weakest in our society. By failing to enforce trafficking laws, public authorities send the very real message to the victims, the weak ones: you are not worthy of protection. Here are 4 reasons I believe that trafficking persists due to public corruption. First, in our annual tip reports, we are not required to address any bribery cases or acts of public corruption within our reports. We must recognize that the bribing and the facilitating of the act is as critical as the trafficker's act himself. That should be included in our reports. Second, there remain certain archaic practices that perpetuate public authority abuse. One such practice internationally is simply to allow authorities who are caught to pay a fine and then move on their way. To a trafficker, this is business. This is solely a tax or a toll to carry on their business. It will just be put in the ledger sheets. Even our judiciaries around the world suffer from a lack of transparency and accountability. In a significant majority of Tier 2 and Tier 2 watch list countries, there is no permanent record of a trial or a court proceeding other than that which is written in longhand by the judge herself. Aside from the immense delay that only protects offenders and not victims, imagine the potential for abuse. Third, many of the highest leaders on a global level rarely address the magnitude of this human rights violation, and therefore they send the inherent message that maybe it's not as real as we all in this room know it to be. A skeptical public cannot be a partner for change. To be here today and to have judges from around the globe gathered to address this international crisis is exactly where this topic needs to be and exactly where it needs to remain in order to inspire immediate change. Throughout history, we have witnessed regularly horrific human rights violations, and usually over time we learn from these violations. We learn reform from our collective shame, and that this should not have occurred under our leadership. Yet, for some reason, the TVPA, for example, was enacted in 2000. Where is the collective shame of 16 years of 30 to 40 million individuals being trafficked each year? Fourth, our public authorities must understand that the victimization of this crime is different. It is the psychological manipulation that breaks down to the breakdown of the human will. That injury is going to deprive our next generation of millions of potential leaders, parents, educators, scientists, academics, because the injury is so great that the victim barely survives and certainly does not thrive. We have an obligation to educate those in the position of authority to be merciful to those victims. There is hope for reform. I always like to end on a positive note. I propose to you 4 changes. 1, add public corruption crimes to the list which needs to be reported in our annual tip reports. Train public authorities to recognize that facilitating human trafficking is aiding and abetting the erosion of a human's will. Putting money in one's pocket at the expense of a person's humanity is not only illegal, it is immoral. Second, work together as a global community to enforce all of our laws internationally and domestically. Use mutual legal assistance treaties, use less formal cooperative efforts to seize evidence and to seek out the offenders and to arrest. Third, educate us, the judiciary, about the unique victimization of this crime. Our rulings need to be enlightened and informative so they can be a beacon to survivors while educating the general public. And we need to provide the judges around the world with the resources necessary to keep an accurate record, because we must instill in the people the faith of rule of law and that the rule of law protects all. And finally, recognize that businesses profit from this and child labor, and they must be accountable. They must be accountable in their supply chains, their corporate social responsibility. We must honor, for example, the UK Anti-Slavery Act. We must not let the World Bank allow funds to be used to continue to allow child labor. I'm inspired by all of you who are gathered here today, and I ask you to join me to eradicate this morally correct thing to do, and it must be done now. Thank you.
Thank you.